She went out for a simple morning run just like she did every day, but this time, she never came back. What followed was a chilling disappearance, a buried past no one saw coming, and a truth that would shake an entire town. This isn't just a story about what was lost, it's about what was found, and how one woman's strength rewrote her destiny. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and drop a comment below. We love seeing this community grow around the world. Now, get comfortable, because this story will stay with you long after it ends. Asterisk. The sun had just begun to rise over the sleepy town of Chestnut Grove, casting a soft golden hue across the tree-lined streets and red brick houses. A few birds chirped lazily from the treetops, and dew still clung to the edges of every leaf and blade of grass. It was the kind of serene morning that made people grateful to live in a quiet corner of the world, where nothing truly bad ever seemed to happen. Claire Whitman stood by the front window of her home, sipping the last of her coffee as she watched the light filter through the pine trees. Her husband Dan sat at the kitchen table behind her, flipping through the local paper and occasionally glancing at the clock. "You going now?" he asked without looking up. Claire smiled, setting her mug in the sink. "Yep, just a quick run. I'll be back before you finish your crossword." She tied her dark hair into a ponytail and pulled on her worn-out running shoes, the same pair she'd used for years on her morning jogs through Maple Trail Park. Claire was a woman of comforting routines. Up at 6, jog at 7, school by 8. As a third-grade teacher at Chestnut Grove Elementary, she had earned a reputation as one of the most patient and nurturing souls in town. Everyone knew Claire. Everyone liked her. Nothing about her life seemed out of the ordinary. That was the most haunting part. She leaned over to kiss Dan goodbye, and he smiled, half distracted, murmuring, "Be safe," as he always did. Claire stepped out into the cool morning air, inhaling deeply. She set off at a steady pace, taking the sidewalk down Rosewood Drive and then veering into the entrance of Maple Trail Park, where a narrow gravel path led through dense trees and winding bends. She'd run this route hundreds of times. The park was her sanctuary, a peaceful stretch of nature where she could let her mind drift and her thoughts breathe. She waved to a man walking his dog and smiled at the old woman who watered her porch plants each morning. It was a run like any other, or so it seemed. By 8:15, Dan looked up again from his crossword. Claire should have been back by now. It wasn't like her to be late. He shrugged it off at first, telling himself she may have run a longer route. But by 8:45, unease had begun to settle in his stomach like a heavy stone. He called her cell phone. No answer. He called again. Still nothing. Stepping outside, he scanned the street, half expecting to see her jogging up the driveway, smiling and apologizing for losing track of time. But the road was empty. His heart began to pound. He called the police just after 9:20, the tremor in his voice betraying his rising panic. "My wife went for a run this morning," he said, forcing calm into his tone. "She hasn't come back." By noon, patrol cars lined the entrance to Maple Trail Park. Officers in bright vests combed through the woods, while search dogs sniffed the ground, barking and pulling at their leashes. Volunteers showed up in droves, neighbors, former students, church friends, all calling Claire's name with growing desperation. Her route was well marked, the paths clearly defined, but she was nowhere to be found. Then, just past a bend near the start of the trail, one of the searchers spotted something glinting in the grass. It was a cell phone. The screen was cracked, and the back casing scuffed, but there was no sign of her. No dropped keys, no torn clothing, no blood, just silence. Word spread quickly through Chestnut Grove. The sweet school teacher, who had never hurt a soul, had simply vanished. Parents hugged their children tighter. Joggers stopped using the trail. A fog of unease crept over the town, thick and suffocating. Dan stood at the center of it all, his face pale, his eyes rimmed with red. He couldn't stop replaying that morning in his head. Had he missed something in her voice? Was there something in her eyes that should have told him? This would be the last time he'd see her smile. Reporters arrived by dusk, setting up cameras just outside the park. A woman with perfect hair and a too sympathetic smile called it a developing mystery. But for the people who knew Claire, it wasn't a mystery, it was a nightmare. Candlelight. Vigils began forming by the park entrance, notes and photographs taped to a growing memorial. Claire's students wrote letters and drawings that said, "We miss you, Mrs. Whitman," their innocence making the pain even sharper. By the end of the first day, the question loomed larger than anything else. How does someone disappear from a park at 7:30 in the morning without anyone seeing a thing? No one had answers. But everyone knew, even in a town as safe as Chestnut Grove, life had changed forever. Something dark had crept in through the morning mist and stolen one of their own, and it had done so without leaving a single trace. As the sun set on that first day, the town of Chestnut Grove found itself wrapped in an unfamiliar cloak of fear. Porch lights that usually stayed off until bedtime now glowed early in every home, casting anxious shadows through windows and across carefully trimmed lawns. It wasn't just that someone had vanished, it was that Claire Whitman had vanished. Claire, who handed out homemade cookies at school fundraisers, who volunteered at the local shelter every Thanksgiving, who left kindness in her wake wherever she went. She was the last person anyone would ever imagine becoming the center of a mystery, and now her name was on the lips of everyone in town, whispered in disbelief and worry. Inside the police station, the energy was tense but focused. Sheriff Linda Coulter, a 52-year-old woman known for her calm head and relentless attention to detail, was already assembling a task force. The conference room wall was filling with maps, timelines, and pinned photographs. Claire's known route through Maple Trail Park was marked in red, her home address circled in blue, and a clock diagram outlined the estimated window of her disappearance. Sheriff Coulter knew all too well how critical the first 24 hours were. The longer they went without a lead, the colder the trail would become. And something about this case already felt cold in a way that chilled her more than she wanted to admit. Dodd Whitman sat in a daze in one of the station's side offices, a paper cup of coffee untouched in his hands. His voice, when he spoke, trembled with helpless frustration. "She always takes the same route," he told the officers. "It's only about 3 miles. She's home by 8:30, 9 at the latest." It was just a normal morning, nothing strange, nothing different. But in a missing person case, normal rarely means safe, and Sheriff Coulter kept circling back to one thing: the phone. Found broken just steps from the trail's entrance, it raised questions too big to ignore. Did she drop it while running? Was it pulled from her hand? Was there someone waiting for her there? By morning, search teams had expanded beyond the park. Drones hovered over thick canopies, bloodhounds sniffed through ravines and brush, and divers were brought in to scan the nearby stream. Every minute that passed was a minute further from the truth. Rumors started slipping between neighbors. Maybe she'd fallen and hit her head. Maybe she'd run away. Maybe this was the one no one wanted to say out loud. Maybe someone had taken her. And if they hadn't left a single clue behind. The community, so tightly bound by tradition and trust, found itself fraying at the edges. People locked their doors in the middle of the day. Mothers no longer let their children ride bikes beyond the driveway. Joggers avoided the park altogether. And yet, in the midst of the fear, something remarkable happened. People showed up. Volunteers from neighboring towns joined the search. A GoFundMe campaign for private investigators and search resources raised thousands in hours. Local restaurants delivered food to tired officers and family friends, manning phone lines. It was as if Claire's very spirit, kind, giving, persistent, ignited something in all of them. At the elementary school, her students sat quietly in their classrooms, their desks too neat, their voices too soft. They didn't fully understand what missing meant. Not really. One little girl, with freckles and a ribbon in her hair, asked her substitute if Mrs. Whitman got lost. "Can't we just make a big sign that says 'This way home' so she can find us?" The teacher smiled gently, hiding tears, and nodded. "That's a beautiful idea." The next morning, dozens of colorful posters lined the sidewalk leading to the school. "Come home, Mrs. Whitman, we love you. Follow the stars back to us. We miss your stories." Dan tried to stay composed, tried to be strong in front of the cameras and the neighbors and the search teams who looked to him for direction. But behind closed doors, the silence in the house was unbearable. Her coffee mug still sat in the sink, her hairbrush was on the vanity, her perfume lingered in the hall, and yet, without her voice, without the sound of her footsteps padding through the kitchen, it all felt lifeless. Friends came and went, some bringing casseroles or sympathy, but nothing filled the hollow space she had left behind. Dawn would sit on the edge of the bed, staring at the place where she'd last stood before her run, trying to recall every word she said that morning, every breath, every glance, as though anything might hold a clue. Back at the park, the sheriff noticed something strange. The area where Claire's phone was found showed no signs of scuffle, no drag marks, no footprints in the opposite direction, not even a broken twig. It was as if she had simply disappeared into the air. A search dog had picked up a scent briefly, but lost it near the trail fork, where a gravel maintenance road intersected with the woods. That's when the sheriff asked to review all security camera footage from nearby intersections and gas stations, hoping something unusual had been caught on tape. In these cases, you looked for out-of-place vehicles, lone figures at odd hours, anything at all. And just before midnight, a deputy brought something to her attention, a red SUV, parked for several minutes on a service road leading into the woods. No one could identify it, and the license plate was obscured by mud. The timestamp was 7:42 a.m. The exact window of Claire's disappearance. It wasn't proof. It wasn't even solid evidence. But it was a beginning. By the third day, the glow of candlelight vigils and community posters had started to dull beneath the weight of questions no one wanted to ask out loud. Claire Whitman, the woman everyone admired, the teacher every child adored, was missing, and despite all the love surrounding her, there was no sign of her, no clue, no message. People started wondering, what if they didn't really know her? Sheriff Coulter sat in her office, flipping through a stack of interviews and statements, each one painting the same image. Claire was kind, Claire was gentle, Claire was loved, but somewhere in the monotony of praise, the sheriff's instincts whispered something different. No one, no matter how sweet or selfless, lives a life without shadows, and if Claire had a shadow, it was time to find it. She started with Claire's phone records, cross-referencing calls and messages from the days leading up to the disappearance. Most were unremarkable texts from Dan, school notifications, friendly exchanges with fellow teachers, but one number stood out. It wasn't saved in her contacts and had called her 3 times over the previous week. No voicemail. Sheriff Coulter traced it to a prepaid phone purchased 2 towns over. That, in itself, wasn't a crime, but it raised an eyebrow. A second eyebrow lifted when she discovered Claire had made multiple trips into Lexington recently, always alone, and without telling Dan. She'd told him she was running errands or buying supplies for school, but the receipts painted a different picture. Purchases from small diners, one-room motels, and a hardware store. It didn't fit the woman people thought they knew. It didn't fit the picture at all. Dawn was called in again, this time with a different tone. The sheriff's questions came gently but firmly. "Was there any trouble between you?" she asked. Watching his face closely, Dan looked stunned. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I mean, we argued sometimes. Sure, what couple doesn't? But Claire, she wasn't the kind of person to keep secrets." But then he paused, as if remembering something just out of reach. "She had been distracted lately," he admitted. "She was on her phone more, seemed nervous sometimes, but when I asked, she said it was just school stuff. I didn't press." Later that day, the sheriff paid a visit to Chestnut Grove Elementary, requesting a private chat with Principal Marian Lutz. The woman's face fell when she heard why the sheriff had come. "I didn't want to say anything before," Marian whispered, her voice tight with guilt, "but Claire came to me last month. She seemed scared, said she thought someone had been watching her. She wouldn't give details. I asked if she wanted to report it, but she just shook her head and said she was probably overreacting. I should have pushed harder." The sheriff asked if anyone else had noticed changes. A fellow teacher, Ms. Jenkins, mentioned Claire staying late after school, often locking her classroom door and drawing the blinds. She said she was grading papers, Ms. Jenkins recalled, but her light would still be on after everyone else had left. "I didn't think much of it at the time. Now I wish I had." And then came another piece of the puzzle. Small, Sharp, a janitor, remembered seeing Claire argue with someone in the staff parking lot about a week before she disappeared. "I didn't see his face," he said, "but he was tall, maybe late 30s, wearing a black jacket. They weren't yelling, but the way he leaned in close to her, it made me uncomfortable." Sheriff Coulter's mind turned back to the red SUV caught on camera. She instructed her team to pull traffic footage from every route between Chestnut Grove and Lexington, hoping to catch a match. In the meantime, she began building a new profile of Claire, not the one written in yearbooks and PTA newsletters, but one formed from actions, silences, and patterns that hadn't made sense until now. Claire had been looking over her shoulder. She'd been locking her doors more often, and she'd been keeping someone, possibly more than one person, completely in the dark. Dan, trying to cope with the surreal swirl of grief and suspicion, began going through Claire's belongings. In the back of her closet, hidden inside an old purse, he found a small spiral notebook. It wasn't a journal exactly, more like fragments of thoughts, some scribbled hastily, others carefully written. One entry read, "If he finds me again, I don't know what I'll do." Another said, "Change route again. Avoid Thursdays." A third, "No one would believe me. Not after what happened last time." Dan stared at the pages, heart pounding. He didn't know who he was. He didn't know what had happened last time. But he knew now that his wife had been carrying more than stress from work. She had been carrying fear. Real, paralyzing fear. Dawn brought the notebook to the sheriff. The next morning, she read through every page, her jaw tightening with each line. The pages didn't name names, but they spoke of someone from the past, someone Claire had tried to leave behind. And suddenly, the case changed shape again. This wasn't just a random abduction. This wasn't bad luck or wrong place, wrong time. This was personal. Someone had been following her, perhaps for weeks, perhaps longer. Sheriff Coulter closed the notebook slowly and looked up at Dan, her eyes full of quiet resolve. "Your wife was hiding something," she said, "and whoever she was hiding from, they may be the one who took her." That night, as the town braced for another day without answers, a fog settled thick over Chestnut Grove, softening the outlines of homes and muffling the world into uneasy silence. Behind every window, people lay awake, wondering if the real Claire Whitman had ever been who they thought she was. And out in the dark, someone knew the truth. Someone had been watching, waiting, and they weren't finished yet. Morning broke slowly over Chestnut Grove, heavy with the kind of silence that clings to a town waiting for answers. For days now, whispers had spread like smoke, rumors, theories, suspicions, all circling back to the same terrifying truth. Claire Whitman had vanished without a trace. But now, there was something. Not just a vague gut feeling or a haunting passage from a notebook. There was an image, a grainy, time-stamped photograph captured by a security camera positioned above a dusty two-lane road just outside Maple Trail Park. The picture was taken at 7:42 a.m., precisely the time Claire would have been jogging through the trees. In it sat a red SUV, paused for several long minutes at a service entrance meant only for maintenance crews. The license plate was unreadable, obscured by a smear of mud and the glare of the rising sun. But the vehicle's presence at that exact time sent a jolt through the case like lightning. Sheriff Coulter stared at the still frame, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the desk as her mind moved faster than her words could follow. There was something deliberate about the SUV's position, parked just beyond view, engine idling. Too close to be a coincidence, too well hidden to be casual. She ordered the team to track down every red SUV registered in a 100-mile radius. It was a needle in a haystack task, but they had to try. For the first time in days, there was direction. Meanwhile, Detective Reyes, her second-in-command, reviewed additional footage from gas stations, ATMs, and roadside diners. Another image surfaced, this one from a fuel pump camera, 15 miles north of Chestnut Grove, the same SUV, same muddy exterior, pulling in just an hour before Claire's disappearance. A tall man stepped out, his face obscured by a ball cap and the camera angle, but his body language was tense, purposeful. He pumped gas quickly, looked over his shoulder twice, and drove off before the receipt even printed. The sheriff froze. The image, she could feel it. This wasn't just a stranger. This was someone who had planned something, and Claire, somehow, had been in his sights. She drove out to the gas station personally, hoping to find anything the footage missed. The clerk on duty remembered the man vaguely. Didn't talk much, he said, paid in cash. Seemed nervous, I guess. Wore a jacket, even though it was already warming up. But lots of people act strange around here lately. Sheriff Coulter walked back to her car with a hollow ache in her chest. It wasn't enough. Not yet. Back in Chestnut Grove, Dan sat with Claire's sister-in-law, Rachel, who had come to stay with him for a few days. Though they weren't especially close, her presence kept the house from feeling entirely hollow. Over breakfast, Rachel hesitated before speaking. "You know, I wasn't going to say anything," she said quietly, "but last month Claire called me, late at night. She said she had this feeling like someone was following her. I told her to call the police, but she just laughed it off. Said she was probably being paranoid, but she wasn't, was she?" Dan said nothing. He just stared at his coffee. heart pounding with helpless fury. Later that afternoon, Dan sat with Sheriff Coulter again. She showed him the image of the SUV, the man at the gas station. "Do you recognize him?" she asked. Dan leaned in, squinting, willing some part of the face or posture to spark recognition, but it didn't. "No," he said slowly. "But Claire, she would have told me if someone had been harassing her, wouldn't she?" The sheriff didn't answer. Instead, she opened Claire's notebook again, pointing to a line scribbled in the corner. "Red car, again. Saw it parked. By the post office. Same one." Dan's breath caught. She noticed it too. "This car has been circling for a while, hasn't it?" The sheriff nodded. "I think she knew she was being watched, and I think whoever was watching her got bold." That night, another lead came in. A local teenager, skimming social media, posted a blurry photo taken weeks ago near the park. In the background, almost unnoticed, was that same SUV, parked crookedly beside a line of trees. The sheriff's office reached out and asked for the original image, hoping digital enhancement might reveal something more. But it was enough to confirm a timeline. The SUV had been seen repeatedly, always near places Claire frequented: school, grocery store, church. This wasn't a one-time encounter. This was stalking. The revelation sent ripples of fear through the town. Women began walking in pairs, locking their doors during the day, checking behind them more often. Something predatory had crept into their quiet lives. The mayor issued a statement urging calm, but no one was calm. Chestnut Grove had become a town of is watchful, wary, and wide open. Sheriff Coulter's team worked into the early hours, cross-referencing every known stalker or harassment report in the Tri-County area. They dug through old case files, prison releases, restraining orders, anything that might match a man with a red SUV, a motive, and an obsession. But it wasn't until a retired dispatcher called in that something finally shifted. "I remember a guy," the woman said over the phone, "back in '09, used to drive a red Bronco, real creep. Hung around the high school even though he wasn't supposed to, claimed he had a sister there. Got arrested for trespassing, I think. Never knew what happened to him." The sheriff pulled the old records. The name on the file was Roy Lanning. No fixed address. Arrested for loitering. Suspicion of harassment. Resisting arrest. Served time. Released 5 months ago. And the kicker, his last known address was in the same Missouri town listed in Claire's sealed juvenile file. Sheriff Coulter's blood ran cold. She looked up at the team and said, "Find everything you can on Roy Lanning, now." Outside, the first drops of rain tapped gently on the windows, as if the sky itself sensed what was coming. The red SUV was no longer a mystery, it was a signal, a warning, and maybe, just maybe, the key to bringing Claire Whitman home. The envelope was plain or return address, no stamp, just a single fold, sealed by time and quiet intention. Dan found it tucked beneath the welcome mat late one evening as he stepped out for a breath of air. At first, he thought it was another sympathy card, one of dozens that had piled up over the last week, filled with kind words and casserole promises. But when he opened it, there was no message of comfort, no signature, just 3 words written in tight, deliberate print. "Ask about Rachel." The words felt colder than the night air, striking through the haze of grief like a bell in a dark church. He read them again, his breath catching. Rachel, it meant nothing. And yet, something in the way it was written, the urgency without explanation, made his skin crawl. Dan brought the note straight to Sheriff Coulter, who sat with her arms crossed and her eyes sharp as razors, reading it once, then twice. Then, placing it gently on her desk as if afraid it might combust, she leaned back in her chair, mind already ticking through possibilities. "Rachel," she murmured. "Claire never mentioned anyone by that name." Dan shook his head. "Not once. I thought maybe it was someone from school, a student or something. But no, Claire didn't keep secrets. Not from me." But that wasn't true anymore, and both of them knew it. The note had the weight of someone who knew Claire deeply, maybe even better than Dan did. Sheriff Coulter ordered a background search for the name Rachel Whitman. Nothing. Then she searched for just Rachel. Still nothing that tied directly to Claire. But then, through sealed juvenile files and archived adoption records buried beneath layers of red tape, something unexpected emerged. Claire Whitman had not always been Claire. She had been born Rachel Ann Driscoll, adopted at age 8. Name changed. Records sealed. Dawn stared at the screen, unblinking. "She never told me." he said again, barely above a whisper. Sheriff Coulter looked at him gently but firmly. She may have had a reason. Whatever happened before the adoption, it was serious enough to hide, and it's possible someone from that part of her life has come back. Don shook his head as if trying to loosen the past from settling over the present. She said her childhood was uneventful. Said her parents died when she was young, and that she moved around a lot. I thought maybe it was just hard for her to talk about. Now, it seemed that what Claire hadn't said was more important than anything she ever had. Determined to follow the lead, the sheriff reached out to the state office that had handled Claire's adoption. Most of the people who worked there back then had long since retired, but one woman remembered the case. She was quiet, the woman said, withdrawn. Pretty girl with these big, serious eyes. Came from Missouri, small town. There was a situation, the kind that doesn't go in official paperwork. She paused. Her last foster father disappeared. No one ever proved anything, but the timing was odd. Claire was relocated shortly after, then adopted. After that, it's like she disappeared into a new life. The story was beginning to twist into something deeper than anyone in Chestnut Grove could have imagined. The sheriff brought this information to Dan, whose face registered shock, confusion, and something Mara heartbreak born, not of betrayal, but of the realization that the woman he loved had been carrying a burden alone all her life. Why wouldn't she tell me? He whispered. Why would she keep that hidden? The sheriff didn't answer, not directly. She only said, whatever happened to Rachel Ann Driscoll didn't stay buried. It followed her here, and someone wants us to know. With the name Rachel now confirmed as Claire's former identity, the sheriff reopened lines of inquiry. She called Missouri law enforcement, requesting files on any cases involving Rachel Driscoll around 1992. A week passed with no reply. Then, late one night, a fax machine in the back of the sheriff's office lit up and began to whir. A case file emerged slowly, its contents aging yellow under the harsh fluorescent lights. Sheriff Coulter read each page like peeling back a scar. The missing foster father's name was Benjamin Holt. Disappeared without a trace on March 3, 1992. No body found, no blood. Just a single statement from an 8-year-old girl named Rachel, who said he'd gone out one night and never came back. The case went cold, and Rachel was placed into protective care. The file included something else, an old black and white photo of Holt. His face, while grainy, bore a strange resemblance to the man in the gas station footage from just days earlier. The same build, similar height. Of course, it couldn't be him. Holt would be in his 70s by now. But there was another possibility, someone connected to him. A brother, a son, or someone else who had reason to seek out Rachel after all these years. Don stared at the photograph, then at the sheriff. You think someone from her past tracked her down? The sheriff nodded. I think someone never forgot what happened in Missouri, and if Claire Archell held any secrets about that night, someone might have been willing to go to terrifying lengths to silence her. Dan clenched his jaw, or punish her. The room went quiet again, filled only by the soft hum of the office around them. Somewhere, out in the dark stretches of the state, someone still had Claire, and it was no longer just a matter of where she was. The question was, what did they want from her and how far would they go to get it? The old photograph sat beneath a dim lamp on Sheriff Coulter's desk, its curling edges lifting slightly with each pass of the fan overhead. Though the image was decades old and blurred around the corners, there was something about the man's eyes, piercing, calculating, that made her uneasy. Benjamin Holt, the name had been nearly lost to time, buried under closed files and forgotten foster reports. But now it echoed like a ghost, dragging its chains through Claire Whitman's carefully constructed life, or Rachel Driscoll's rather. The sheriff leaned back in her chair, chewing on the end of a pen as she considered her next move. If Claire had changed her name and her life to escape whatever happened back then someone had made it their business to unearth the past, and not just to find her, to take her. The Missouri authorities confirmed what the sheriff had already suspected. Benjamin Holt had been under quiet investigation for years before his disappearance, suspected of inappropriate behavior toward minors. Never enough to charge, but enough that the agency had been planning to remove Rachel from his care. They just hadn't gotten there in time. Then he vanished. No note, no car, no trace. The only one who knew what happened, perhaps, was the frightened 8-year-old girl who claimed he'd gone out one evening and never came back. Was it true? Or had Rachel seen something or done something she'd never spoken of again? But the real surprise came when Coulter asked about surviving relatives. The woman on the other end of the call hesitated before answering. Benjamin didn't have any children, officially, but there was someone, a nephew. The family was estranged, so it's not well documented. Last we heard, the kid changed his name, moved around a lot, but you might try looking for someone who once went by the name Robert Lanning. The moment the name hit the air, something clicked in the sheriff's mind. Roy Lanning, the man they'd connected to the red SUV, the one who'd been loitering near Claire's school, the same man recently released from a correctional facility just months before Claire disappeared. Coulter stood up so quickly, her chair nearly toppled over. She ordered her team to cross every detail. Roy Lanning's known addresses, employment history, phone activity, vehicle registrations. Slowly, a web began to form. Lanning had lived under aliases, moved across state lines frequently, and had a habit of disappearing just before police caught up to him. He'd been cited for trespassing, harassment, and once had a restraining order filed by a woman who said he followed her for months after she refused a date. The most damning detail: the red SUV wasn't registered in his name but in the name of a woman he'd briefly dated, who'd reported it stolen 6 weeks ago. Coulter now had enough to bring him in, but first, they had to find him. Meanwhile, Dan stood in Claire's old classroom, the chalkboard still smudged with the last words she'd written, a spelling list that now felt heartbreakingly mundane. He looked around at the colorful posters, the lined-up desks, the tiny paper butterflies Claire had taped to the windows. Everything here was so full of her touch, yet hollow in her absence. He reached into the bottom drawer of her desk, sifting through lesson plans and sticker sheets, until his fingers brushed a manila envelope marked private. Inside was a single-folded document, a paternity test. At first it didn't register. Then he saw the names, Rachel Ann Driscoll and Robert Lanning. Below them, the result, possible biological half-sibling, 99.2% probability. Dan's stomach turned to stone. He brought the paper to the sheriff, his hands trembling. She knew, he whispered. Claire knew who he was. Sheriff Coulter scanned the page, her face grim. Not just that, she said. She suspected they were related. Maybe even that he was part of her foster past. That's why she kept the notebook, changed her running routes, never told you everything. She knew someone from that dark place had found her again. It explained the tension, the secrecy, the note under the doormat. Someone had sent a warning ask about Rachel because they knew this wasn't just about a missing woman. It was about unfinished history, buried connections, and someone with a long, twisted memory. By now, Coulter had a warrant out for Roy Lanning's arrest and a task force sweeping every highway, motel, storage unit, and rental cabin within a 100-mile radius. They didn't know how far he'd gone or whether Claire was still with him, but time was no longer a luxury. Then came a break. A motel clerk outside Tulsa called in to report a guest matching Lanning's description. Nervous, paid in cash, drove a red SUV with mismatched plates, claimed he was traveling with his niece, though the woman never left the room. He checked out 2 hours ago, but the room was still intact. Inside, investigators found a single hairbrush, strands of dark hair, and a torn photograph Claire, as a teenager, standing in front of an unfamiliar farmhouse. The farmhouse, they learned, was in Missouri, a place Claire had once called home, a place tied to Benjamin Holt, and likely, the last place she ever wanted to see again. Sheriff Coulter stared at the photograph for a long time. "He's taking her back," she muttered, "to where it all began." As the team plotted the quickest route, Dan stood at the sheriff's side, his face pale but steady. "I'm going with you," he said. The sheriff didn't argue, she only nodded. "Then let's bring her home." The road stretched out like an old scar, winding through the forgotten corners of Missouri where the trees stood tall and heavy, branches knitted close like they were trying to hide something. Sheriff Coulter drove with her hands tight on the wheel, eyes fixed on the horizon, headlights cutting through the dense gray of early dawn. Dan sat beside her, silent, holding the photograph they'd found at the motel, the one of Claire as a teenager, staring into the camera with a stiff smile and shadows in her eyes. Behind her, the crumbling farmhouse leaned sideways like a secret long left to rot. Neither of them said much, but the silence was full of fear, of hope, of questions neither of them could voice yet. The only thing they knew for certain was this: Roy Lanning was dragging Claire back to where it all began, and if they didn't find him soon, The ending might echo the horrors she'd escaped all those years ago. Back at the command center in Chestnut Grove, Reyes and the team were working non-stop, tracking every signal, every purchase, every camera hit along Lanning's path. They confirmed he'd crossed state lines 2 nights ago, stopping only for gas and fast food. No credit cards, no phone activity, just grainy sightings and silent miles. It was almost as if he'd rehearsed this, as if he'd known exactly how to vanish. But what haunted Sheriff Coulter more than his cunning was his motive. Why now? Why return after decades? If Claire had been a child when their paths first crossed, if he truly was Holt's nephew, or worse, something closer, what did he want from her now? Vengeance, validation, or something more twisted? There were wounds in this story older than anyone had realized, and they were bleeding again. As they neared the old Holt property, the sheriff slowed the vehicle. The fields on either side were overgrown, dotted with rusted tractors and forgotten fencing. A mailbox leaned at a crooked angle, the name long scratched off, but the gravel path that wound back into the woods was unmistakable. It matched the photo they turned in, tires crunching over stone and brittle leaves. With every turn, Dan's heart beat louder. This was the place Claire had tried to erase from her life, and now it had become her prison again. The house came into view slowly, rising like a ghost through the Trieste stories, its roof sagging, its windows clouded with grime. The porch was rotting, and the front door hung slightly ajar, swaying. In the breeze, Sheriff Coulter reached for her radio, signaling her team to move in from the rear. Dan, despite her earlier warning to stay back, opened his door and stepped out, his breath catching in the cold morning air. He didn't care what he might find, he just knew she was in there, somewhere. That they entered carefully, weapons drawn, senses sharp. The inside smelled of mildew and old wood, of years gone sour, furniture covered in sheets, a broken lamp in the corner, water stains blooming across the ceiling. But what chilled them more than the decay was the silence. No footsteps, no breathing, not even a creak. Sheriff Coulter motioned to a hallway that led toward the back of the house. Dan followed her, heart pounding, eyes darting from door to door. Then, from behind the last one, they heard a muffled sound, a voice, hoarse and small. "Help!" The sheriff lunged forward, kicking the door open. Claire was there, tied to a chair, her face pale, lips cracked, but her eyes alive wide, burning with fear and recognition. "Dan," she breathed. "He's still." But before she could finish, a figure burst from the shadows behind the old curtain, roaring like a cornered animal. Roy Lanning. He moved fast, brandishing a rusted blade, eyes wild and glassy. Sheriff Coulter raised her weapon, shouting, "Drop it!" But he lunged toward Dan. Everything that followed moved in. Flashes, Dan stumbling back, Coulter firing once, then again. The shots cracked through the air like thunder, and Roy dropped, crumpling in a heap on the floor, the knife clattering beside him. It was over in seconds, but the silence afterward felt endless. Don rushed to Claire, cutting her free, gathering her into his arms as she collapsed against him, trembling but breathing. Sheriff Coulter checked Lanning's pulse. Gone, just like Holt had vanished before him. Another chapter ending in violence. Another scar added to a story already carved deep. Outside, backup arrived, lights flashing through the trees, radios crackling with confirmation. Claire was wrapped in blankets, paramedics checking her vitals, but she never let go of Dan's hand. She kept looking at him like she wasn't sure he was real, like part of her had stopped believing anyone would come. He kissed her forehead, whispering again and again, "I've got you. You're safe now. I'm here." As dawn crept higher into the sky, painting gold over the broken house, Sheriff Coulter stood quietly by her car, watching the wind stir the trees and scatter leaves down the gravel path. They had found her, alive, barely, but the ghosts they'd uncovered in the process would not fade easily. For Claire, the past was no longer hiding. It had come for her, dragged her back into its darkness, but she had survived, again, and this time, she wouldn't have to carry the weight alone. The hospital room was quiet but not peaceful. Machines hummed softly, blinking lights casting pale glows across the sterile walls, and the scent of antiseptic clung to every surface like memory. Claire lay in the narrow bed, her hands trembling, faintly beneath the blankets, eyes staring at the ceiling, though she wasn't really seeing it. Beside her, Dan sat unmoving, fingers loosely entwined with hers, anchoring her to the present, as if afraid that if he let go, she might vanish again, this time for good. Outside the window, the Missouri countryside stirred beneath the wind, the trees just beginning to blush with the first signs of fall. But inside this room, time felt suspended, like they were trapped between breaths, waiting for something that hadn't yet arrived. Sheriff Coulter stood near the doorway, arms crossed, watching. She had seen victims before, many of them broken by things no human should ever have to endure. But Claire was different. There was something in her face, not just the raw exhaustion of trauma, but something deeper, more complicated. It wasn't just what Roy Lanning had done to her. It was what had been buried long before him, the part no one had been allowed to see. And now the walls were down. "I need to talk to her," Coulter said quietly. Dan looked up, weary but understanding. He leaned down, kissed Claire's temple, and whispered something only she could hear before stepping out. Coulter moved to the chair he'd left behind and sat, folding her hands in her lap. "Claire," she said gently, "we found the connection. We know who Roy was. We know about the past. But I need to hear it from you. I need you to tell me what happened." Claire didn't respond for a long time. Her breathing was slow, shallow. Then, finally, she turned her head, meeting the sheriff's eyes. "His real name wasn't Roy," she said, voice hoarse. "He used to be called Bobby. Bobby Holt, Ben's nephew. He was always around when I was little, too old to be playing with me, but he would anyway. Always watching, following. When Ben disappeared, he said I owed him, that I took something from him. He came to see me in foster care once, just once. Told me I'd pay one day." Coulter listened without interrupting, her face unreadable, her heart thudding with the quiet horror of what she was hearing. Claire swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "I thought I'd escaped. New name, new town, a good life, Dan, teaching. I buried Rachel Driscoll so deep, I forgot she was even real. But a few months ago, I saw him, outside the grocery store. I thought it was my mind playing tricks, but then he showed up again. At school, he never said anything, just stood across the street, watching. I didn't tell Dan. I didn't want to scare him. I thought maybe if I didn't acknowledge it, he'd go away. But he didn't." Her voice broke, and she looked away. "He left things in our mailbox, photos, old ones, of me as a kid, of Ben, of the house. Then came the notes. I knew he wanted me to remember, and I did. Every terrible thing I'd pushed down. I couldn't sleep, could barely eat. I started changing my routine, switching up my runs, watching over my shoulder. But he always found me, always stayed one step ahead." Coulter reached out, gently placing her hand over Claire's. "You survived something no child should have had to endure. And then you survived it again. You're here now, Claire. You're safe." Claire shook her head. "Am I? He wanted me to go back there, to the house. He said it was where I belonged. Said it was time to finish what we started. I don't know what that meant. I don't know if he believed I killed Ben, or if he thought I knew who did. But he wanted me to pay for it, one way or another." The sheriff's voice was low but steady. "You didn't kill Benjamin Holt, Claire. We may never know what happened to him, but the girl you were back then, she did the only thing she could to survive. And I'll be damned if anyone tries to punish her for that now." Claire blinked, and a tear slipped down her cheek. She nodded slowly, as if allowing herself to believe it. Over the next few days, as the physical bruises began to fade, the psychological ones remained tender. Claire spoke more, little by little, each word another brick removed from the wall she'd built to keep her pain hidden. Dan never left her side. Sometimes they sat in silence, sometimes they talked late into the night, unpacking memories, one by one like fragile keepsakes. He told her he didn't care what name she was born with, or what she'd done to survive. "You're Claire to me," he said. "You've always been Claire." The town began to shift to Chestnut Grove had been holding its collective breath for so long that when Claire returned, a wave of cautious relief swept through its streets. People brought casseroles again, flowers, notes of encouragement, and while not everyone understood the story, they respected the resilience. Her students sent drawings, her neighbors lit candles. It wasn't everything, but it was something, and something was enough. One afternoon, Claire stood by the window, watching leaves tumble across the yard. Dan came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You don't have to go back," he whispered. "Not to teaching. Not to anything you're not ready for." Claire didn't answer right away. Then she reached up, touched his hand, and said, "I think I do. Not for them, for me. Because when the walls finally come down, what's left behind isn't just Penit's truth. And sometimes, truth is the first breath of freedom." Autumn deepened over Chestnut Grove, casting golden light through thinning trees and painting the sidewalks with crisp, brittle leaves. The town, though quieter now, still pulsed with the aftermath of everything that had been unearthed. People moved a little more gently, their greetings more intentional, like the whole place had taken a collective breath and decided not to exhale just yet. Inside her modest home at the edge of Maple Trail, Claire sat at the dining table, surrounded by a scattered mosaic of memory's old photographs, newspaper clippings, court records, and a notebook that had once served as her lifeline when she had no one to speak her fears aloud to. The pages were filled with careful notations, dates, faces, patterns she hadn't fully understood until they had come to a violent crescendo. Now, she turned each page slowly, studying every entry, every scribble, every unanswered question, because though the man who had haunted her was gone, the truth was still incomplete, and she needed to know the whole story. Sheriff Coulter stopped by just after lunch, bringing a brown folder stamped confidential and a to-go coffee that was too strong and a little burnt, just the way Claire used to drink it. They sat together without formalities, like women who had both fought long, invisible battles and no longer had patience for small talk. "I pulled everything I could from Missouri," Coulter said, setting the folder down. "There's something here I think you need to see." Claire opened the folder slowly, heart tightening. Inside were documents she recognized, the old adoption forms, social worker notes, and one photograph she had never seen before. It showed Benjamin Holt with a much younger Bobby Roy in front of the farmhouse, arms around each other, both wearing identical grins. But it wasn't the smile that caught her attention. It was what was written on the back in blue ink, a message in Holt's handwriting. "To Bobby, the son I never had." Claire's breath caught. He called him his son. Coulter nodded. "No birth certificate connects them, but everything points to it. Holt raised him, mentored him, treated him like blood. After Holt disappeared, Bobby spiraled. Juvenile records show arrests, expulsions, probation, and every time he got into trouble, he'd tell officers the same thing. She took him from me. He was obsessed. Claire, fixated. He saw you as the reason Holt vanished." Claire blinked hard, memory pressing against her like a tide. "But I didn't do anything. I was just a child." "Exactly," Coulter said. "But obsession doesn't require truth. It just needs belief. And Bobby believed you robbed him of the only father figure he had." Claire looked down at her hands, still trembling slightly, despite the days that had passed. "He told me, when he tied me up, he said he'd been waiting 30 years to make it right, that everything went wrong after I left, that he'd been invisible ever since. But he wasn't just trying to hurt me. He wanted to take me back to that house, to that version of me. It was like he needed to rewrite it, needed me to admit to something I never did." Coulter's voice softened. He was trying to reclaim power, not just over Holt's memory but over you, and that house was his stage, his twisted altar. He wanted to bring it full circle. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Claire asked the question that had haunted her every night since her rescue. "Do you think he killed Ben?" The sheriff sighed. "We'll never know for certain. There was no body, no confession, but the circumstantial evidence is strong, and given what we now understand about his mind, I believe it's very possible. If Holt planned to leave everything to you, or if he began to show signs of guilt, remorse, maybe Bobby snapped. Maybe he blamed you because you were the last variable in Holt's life." Claire closed the folder slowly, feeling both heavier and lighter all at once. "He spent his life chasing a ghost, and he tried to make me carry it with him. But you didn't," Coulter said. "You survived." Later that evening, Claire and Dan sat together in the living room, the fireplace crackling softly, a tray of untouched tea growing cold between them. Dan had listened to every word she shared without judgment or interruption, holding space for every emotion she released. "I wish I'd known sooner," he said. "Not because I would have changed anything, but because you carried that pain alone for so long. And you didn't have to." Claire rested her head on his shoulder. "I didn't want to ruin the life we built. I was scared that if you saw what was behind me, you'd run." Dan pulled her closer. "I didn't marry your past, Claire. I married your heart, and nothing about that has changed." That night, Claire returned to her journal for the first time in weeks, not to record danger or document threats, but to write down truth, her truth. She wrote about Rachel Driscoll, the child who had been lost and frightened, about Claire Whitman, the woman who rebuilt herself from ashes, and about all the pieces in between, the ones she had tried to hide, but now could finally face. She wrote until her hand ached, until the words stopped trembling, and the silence around her felt warm instead of hollow. She wrote because now she could, because now she knew the story wasn't just about what had been done to her, but about how she had come through it. And as the final leaves of fall slipped past the windows and winter crept toward Chestnut Grove, Claire began to believe something she hadn't dared hope for in a long time, that the worst was finally behind her, and that maybe, just maybe, she was strong enough to step fully into whatever came next. Chestnut Grove was small, the kind of town where time didn't race ahead, but moved like a gentle stream, winding through the seasons with quiet patience, and though its streets were lined with familiar porches and weathered mailboxes, its people were not immune to change, especially not now. After Claire's return, after the news broke, after whispers became headlines, the town didn't retreat into silence. It leaned in, because while small towns have a reputation for forgetting the things that make them uncomfortable, they also have a heart that remembers the people who matter. And Claire Whitman mattered, not just because of what she'd survived, but because of who she had always been to them, even when they didn't know the whole story at first. There were awkward glances at the grocery store, pauses in conversation when she walked by, as if people weren't sure whether to speak or stay silent. But Claire, ever brave, ever composed even when she didn't feel it, chose to meet those stares with soft smiles and steady eyes. She walked through town like someone reclaiming a piece of herself with each step. She stopped at the bakery for a muffin, waved to the mailman, returned library books, and slowly, hesitantly, Chestnut Grove opened its arms again. Children from her class sent hand-drawn cards, pictures of apples and hearts, and brave stick-figure teachers standing tall. A group of parents organized a dinner train of casseroles, soups, and pies, so numerous Claire joked that her freezer now looked like the school's staff lounge. But not everyone was ready to move on. Pastor Emmons invited Claire to speak at Sunday service, to share her story if she wanted. She thanked him gently and declined, not out of fear but out of choice. Her healing didn't need to be on display. It didn't need a podium. It was happening every day in quiet moments, in small decisions, in laughter that came a little easier each week. Sheriff Coulter, too, kept a respectful distance unless called, though she checked in every so often. People keep asking how you're doing, she told Claire one afternoon. I tell them you're walking forward. That seems to satisfy them. Claire appreciated that. Because she was walking forward, she started volunteering twice a week at the local shelter, helping kids with homework, folding laundry, serving hot meals. Not because she wanted to play hero, but because she remembered being one of them once. A girl with a tangled past and no map for the future. She saw pieces of herself in their eyes, especially the quiet ones, the ones who watched instead of speaking, who flinched when touched too suddenly. She never asked questions they weren't ready to answer. She just showed up week after week, like someone who had finally learned that presence was its own kind of medicine. Dan remained her constant. Their love had changed, deepened, grounded by truth and resilience. They no longer tiptoed around the past. Some nights they sat with it, talked it through like old scars that still ached when the weather turned. But more often now, they planned for what came next. Dan had talked about taking a sabbatical from his veterinary practice, maybe traveling once Claire felt ready. She'd always wanted to see the Oregon coast, to walk barefoot in the sand with no destination but the rhythm of the waves. Let's do it, she told him one night, her head on his chest, fingers tracing invisible shapes against his arm. Let's go someplace where no one knows our names. But before they left, there was one more thing she needed to do. The school board had offered her position back without hesitation. Principal Hernandez called her personally, voice thick with emotion, saying, "Claire, we need you, but only if it's what you want." And so, on a bright Monday morning, Claire returned to Maplewood Elementary, her heels clicking softly against the polished floors, her bag slung over one shoulder. The halls were filled with the usual chaos of childhood laughter, spilled juice boxes, the distant cry of a lost lunchbox, and it was perfect, because it was normal, because it was hers. Her students, who had been told only that Miss Whitman had been on a long break, lit up when she entered. They ran to her, wrapped arms around her legs, tugged at her hands. One little girl whispered, "I missed your stories," and Claire knelt, smiled, and replied, "I brought new ones." And she had not the kind born of fear or loss, but the kind spun from courage, from hope, the kind that reminded her who she was before the shadows tried to take her name. Later that week, as the sun began to dip behind the rooftops, the town gathered at the annual fall festival. It was a tradition that stretched back generations, a blend of cider stands, hayrides, and music under twinkle lights. Claire and Dan stood among their neighbors, watching children bob for apples, couples dance, grandparents laugh. It was ordinary and magical all at once. And when someone from the crowd began a round of applause, not for any speech or ceremony, but just because she was there, because she'd returned, Claire felt something shift inside her. Not embarrassment, not fear, but belonging, because the town hadn't forgotten, not the darkness, but more importantly, not the light she brought with her. And as she stood in the golden wash of twilight, surrounded by the town that had once only known a part of her, she knew now that they saw the whole woman, and they were standing with her. The first time Claire stood in front of a mirror and truly saw herself again. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind where sunlight crept through the curtains, just enough to kiss the corners of the room without demanding too much of the day. She stood in her bathroom, hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter, her hair still damp from the shower, her skin flushed from the warmth of the water. And as she looked into her own eyes, tired, but unmistakably clear, she realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't hiding anymore. The silence that had once wrapped around her like armor had begun to crack, to fall away piece by piece, and in its place came something she hadn't dared hope for: peace. For so long, silence had been her language. It had protected her when she was Rachel. It had shielded her when the world was too sharp and the truth too dangerous. Even as Claire, when life had become softer and filled with love, she had still held her breath in certain moments, afraid that speaking would invite the past back in. But now, after everything, after the abduction, the farmhouse, the rescue, the long unraveling of memory, she had begun to breathe deeply again. Not because the past no longer existed, but because she finally understood that it didn't define her. It had shaped her, yes, but it no longer held the pen to write her future. That understanding came slowly, through long talks with Dan, through quiet journaling by lamplight, and through unexpected conversations with those who had once only known her as Miss Whitman, the beloved second-grade teacher with a kind smile and a gentle voice. One afternoon, she found herself in the school library, sorting through a box of books donated by a parent, when she felt a tug on her sleeve. It was Trevor, a shy boy who had transferred mid-year and rarely spoke above a whisper. He held out a crumpled drawing of a house with dark windows and a little figure standing in front of it, hands raised. "This is where I used to live," he said. Claire knelt beside him, her voice soft. "That looks like a heavy place to carry." Trevor nodded. "Sometimes I don't like to talk about it." She placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "That's okay. You don't have to. But if you ever do, I'll listen." His eyes brightened slightly, and in that moment, she saw a reflection of herself. Someone learning that silence didn't have to mean solitude. Word of her quiet resilience had reached further than she realized. A reporter from a local magazine reached out, asking if she'd be willing to do an interview, not for scandal, not for ratings, but to tell her story in her own voice. At first, she hesitated. What could she say that hadn't already been twisted or whispered? But something in her shifted, and she agreed. Sitting down across from the young journalist in her living room, she didn't read from notes or recite rehearsed lines. She spoke slowly, honestly. She spoke not as a victim, but as a woman who had clawed her way back to the surface and decided to stay. "I used to think my silence kept me safe," she told the reporter, "but now I see it only made the pain grow louder inside. Speaking didn't erase what happened, but it gave me room to breathe, to remember without drowning." The article, when it was published, didn't sensationalize. It didn't dwell on Roy Lanning's crimes or on the trauma of the past. Instead, it painted a portrait of courage, of a woman who had faced the worst kind of darkness and emerged, not unscarred, but unbroken. The ripple effect was immediate. Letters poured in, some from strangers, others from people she'd once known and long forgotten. Survivors, teachers, former foster children. Each one carried words of gratitude, of solidarity, of hope. A retired counselor wrote, Your voice gave me the strength to finally speak to my own daughter about what happened to me when I was her age." A woman from another state shared, "I never reported my stepfather. I thought no one would believe me. But your story made me realize I still can." Claire read each letter slowly, carefully, like prayers whispered, in a language only the hurting understand. And with each one, the silence inside her thinned further, until it felt like mist more than a wall. Dan watched this transformation with awe. He saw how her eyes brightened when she read the letters, how her shoulders began to rest lower with each passing day. They talked about the future more now, not in hushed tones, but with genuine excitement. Maybe they would visit the Oregon coast, maybe she would write a book, maybe she would start a small support group for women who had endured what she had. Not as a therapist, but as a peer, someone who could simply sit beside them and say, "I know." And through it all, the town continued to hold her up, not with grand gestures, but with quiet, steady presence. The librarian reserved books for her on healing and identity. The coffee shop left a note on her to-go cup, "You are seen." And during the next town council meeting, the mayor read a statement acknowledging her courage and her contribution to the community, not just in the classroom, but as a symbol of strength. Claire didn't cry during the speech. She smiled, nodded politely. But later that night, alone with Dan under the soft hum of their porch light, she let the tears fall, not of pain, but of release, because silence had once been her shield. But now, her truth was her freedom, and with every word she shared, every connection she allowed, she loosened the weight that had once buried her voice. It didn't mean the past would disappear. It meant she had finally learned to live beside it and no longer beneath it. The winter sun rose slow and pale over Chestnut Grove, casting long shadows over rooftops dusted in frost. The town moved at its usual unhurried pace, but something felt different now, not just in the way neighbors smiled longer when they passed Claire on the street, or how children in her classroom looked at her with admiration that had nothing to do with multiplication tables, but in the quiet sense that something heavy had finally lifted. The storm had passed, and though it had left its mark, it had not swept her away. Claire stood at her window that morning, holding a warm mug between her palms, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the world outside tilt gently toward a new beginning. She was still here, and that truth alone felt like a triumph. There had been a time not long ago when she hadn't been sure she would ever feel normal again, when waking up had meant bracing herself for memories that came like knives, when the sound of wind against the house made her heart seize, when every friendly face felt like a question she couldn't answer. But the fear had dulled now, like the ache of an old bruise. It was still there, a faint echo in the bones, but no longer defining her every step. Healing, she had come to understand, wasn't a moment. It was a journey made up of thousands of tiny choices, choosing to get out of bed, to speak, to trust, to hope. And for the first time in years, maybe ever, Claire was beginning to imagine a life beyond survival. She and Dan had started making plans again, not the kind whispered between cautious glances, but real, tangible things. They booked the trip to Oregon, finally, a cabin on the coast, just the two of them. The photos on the travel site showed rugged cliffs and silver beaches, wind-swept trees leaning into the sea like old souls, tired but unbroken. It felt like the right place to begin again, to breathe in the salt air and let it carry away everything they no longer needed to hold. "We'll walk the shoreline," Dan had said, smiling as he traced the edge of the map. "No phones, no schedules, just us." And Claire had nodded, heart full, already imagining the way the ocean might sound at night, steady, deep, forgiving. At school, she returned to her classroom fully. Her students had missed her, and she had missed them. Not just the lessons and routines, but the small, extraordinary things, the look on a child's face when they finally understood something, the hush that fell over the room when she opened a storybook, the warm chaos of crayons and questions and giggles. She brought more of herself to her teaching now, not less. She told stories that hinted at resilience, read books about bravery not born from swords but from kindness, and left space in her lessons for the truths that weren't always found in textbooks. The children responded, they leaned in, they listened, and in their trust, Claire found a new kind of strength. People in town still asked how she was doing, but now it was with genuine care, not cautious curiosity, and she answered them honestly. Not every day was easy, some nights were still restless, but she was here, living, growing, choosing joy even when it trembled. The weight of what had happened, the abduction, the confrontation, the long unspoken past no longer sat like a stone on her chest. It had become something else, a story, yes, but one she owned now, one she could tell in her own words, on her own terms. It didn't define her, it simply explained the road she'd walked to get here. One evening, as the first snow began to fall in soft spirals across the town square, Claire and Dan hosted a quiet dinner with a few close friends, Sheriff Coulter, Principal Hernandez, even Pastor Emmons, who brought a caramel pie and a smile that didn't need scripture. They laughed, they toasted, they shared small memories and plans for the new year. No one mentioned the past directly, but it lingered in the warmth between them, in the unspoken gratitude for survival and second chances. At one point, Claire stood to refill drinks, and as she looked around the room, she felt a sudden swell of emotion, not sadness, not pain, but fullness. This, she thought, this is what rebuilding looks like. Later, curled up on the couch with Dan, the fire crackling low, she opened her journal once more. The final pages were still blank. She ran her hand over them slowly, thinking about how many times before she had filled pages with fear, with confusion, with fragments of who she was trying to become. But now, at last, she felt ready to write something different. Not an ending, not even a conclusion, but a new chapter. She picked up her pen and began to write, the words coming steady. Sure, there was once a girl who lost her name, she began, and in losing it, she found the strength to build a new one. She lived in a quiet town, surrounded by good people, haunted by shadows that once seemed endless. But she didn't vanish, she didn't surrender, she stayed, she healed, and she began again. Outside, snow blanketed the streets, covering the old and the new in equal measure. It softened the edges of things, turned rooftops into poetry, and whispered promises only the brave could hear. Claire closed her journal, leaned into Dan's shoulder, and listened, not for danger, not for the past, but for the steady rhythm of the world, continuing on. She smiled, because this time, she was ready to walk forward without looking back. She was no longer just the woman who went for a morning run and vanished. She was the woman who returned, who faced the darkness, and who chose, every single day, to live. And so, from a single morning run to the shadows of the past, and back into the light, Claire's journey reminds us all that healing isn't always loud, but it is powerful. Sometimes, the quietest strength is the kind that changes everything. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and listening to this story. If Claire's journey touched you, moved you, or reminded you of something in your own life, we'd truly love to hear about it. Please don't hesitate to leave a comment and share your thoughts or personal story. We read every one, and your voice matters here. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue telling heartfelt, meaningful stories like this one. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Take care of yourself and each other. See you in the next story.